Hello,
Hi, is David Maraniss there?
this is David. It's Maraniss, but I'll
Maraniss.
answer to anything.
Sorry about that. How you doing, David? It's Mike and Jay
Fine.
from the Detroit Cast.
Hi, David.
Hey,
Hey,
how you guys doing?
we're doing good. Sorry we're running a little bit late here. Traffic was a nightmare in Detroit. The book, Once in a Great City, a Detroit story, very good, man. What a beautiful book, first off.
Oh, well, thank you.
Yeah, I as simple as like the papering that you used on this, I found it awesome.
Well, I like the aesthetics of books, too. Sometimes I buy them just because I like the cover.
You
Yeah.
can never judge a book by its cover, I've heard. But
Well, I do. Doesn't mean it's good, but it means I like to hold it.
Well, it's an impressive book. It must have taken you forever to write.
It took about three and a half years, which is my rhythm. Almost all of my larger books have been about that pattern. It takes about a year and a half to research, and then I start writing and keep researching till the last page. But that's sort of the way it goes with all of my books, and it went with this one.
yeah, you can definitely tell it's heavily researched, and I think that's one
Yeah.
aspect of this that people will like. Certainly, local people who have an overview of all these subjects are going to love how far you've dug into them.
Well, one of the things that has meant the most to me since the book came out is so many people with histories in Detroit have said I got it right, or that I found things that they didn't know. So,
Well, there's tons in here that I didn't know, and I've lived here almost my whole life.
Yeah, and David, talk about how you approach this. It's an interesting approach in that you grabbed a 2-year period in the 60s as a bit of
Yeah.
a tipping point.
One of sort of my philosophies of all of my work, whether it's my books or stories at the Washington Post, is to set up an oil rig somewhere and to dig down as deeply as I can. And I've always rather gone deep than wide and shallow. So, and I feel that I can tell a larger story through a specific period of time that gives the reader a sense of place and chronology in an easier way to understand. And so, the way I thought about the book, as I've said many times, it came to me watching the M&M commercial at Super Bowl Sunday in 2011. That wonderful
Chrysler ad.
that brought me to tears, which I wasn't expecting. It really affected me emotionally because I was born in Detroit and hadn't really thought about it that much over the many decades since I left. And that commercial brought it all back to me. And, of course, my wife said, you sucker, why are you falling for that? They're just trying to sell Chryslers. And Detroit's a mess. And she was right, but it hit me at a deeper level. So then I started thinking about what I can do to honor Detroit. And I'm a writer, so I wanted to write. I knew that Detroit was probably heading toward bankruptcy at that point, but I'm not a financial writer. There are other people that can do that part of the story. I'm a historian, a nonfiction narrative writer, and my whole mission was to write about what Detroit gave America. And so then I started thinking about what it did give America, which is an enormous amount. Not just the obvious of cars and music, Motown, but also it played a very important role in the civil rights movement of the 1960s, and it was the center of the American labor movement, the sort of disappeared labor movement that was so important to American sociology and culture for most of the 19th and 20th centuries. So once I settled on those four themes, then I set my oil rig at a place where I could write about them all. And civil rights took me to the 60s, so did Motown. And then I decided I wanted to write about things before the riots of 1967, when everything was still up in the air. You didn't know which way things were going to go, but you could see the seeds of what was to come. And that's what took me to that period between the fall of 1962 and the spring of 1964.
Is it hard to get research material? I mean, I imagine a lot of key figures have passed on, and
yes, almost all of the major figures in my book are long gone.
Right.
That includes the mayor of that period, Jerome Kavanaugh, Aretha Franklin's father, Reverend C.L. Franklin, who was a significant preacher in that period. The Deuce, Henry Ford II, who ran Ford Motor Company. Berry Gordy is still alive. He's one of the few major characters that was still around. Of course, a lot of the Motown singers are still there. Mm-hmm. But in terms of the major figures in my book, Gordy is one of them, and I was able to interview, but the others are gone. But in terms of research, I sort of talk about what I call the four legs of a table. And the first leg is to go there, wherever there is. So my wife and I spent a lot of time in Detroit. We'd stay usually at a little bed and breakfast called the Inn on Ferry Street, and that was convenient to a lot of the parts of the second leg of my table, which is archival research. The Walter Reuther Library at Wayne State University had all of the papers of the mayor, had all of the papers of one of the central events in my book, the Walk to Freedom in June of 1963, where Martin Luther King came to town and gave his I Have a Dream speech in Detroit before he did it in Washington. All of that material was at the Reuther Library. The Detroit Public Library had a lot of material. There's an African-American archive and museum in Detroit that helped me. So, archives are the second aspect of my research. The third leg of the table is interviews, and even though the central figures were gone, there were still dozens and dozens of people who were from that period who I could talk to, and I found most of them in Detroit. Some of them were elsewhere, as some of the archives were elsewhere. One important archive for me was at Duke University. That's where all of the papers of the J. Walter Thompson Advertising Agency, which ran the Mustang advertising campaign, the largest commercial campaign in history to that point. I found all of those materials at Duke. So I traveled around the country, spent a lot of time in Detroit, and that's how I put it all together.
Did you find that one of the themes, you mentioned that your four main, branches that you looked into, the autos, the labor, Motown, and civil rights, did you see yourself gravitating to one as maybe your favorite one as you dug into it? I really enjoyed, I think, the discussion of Motown quite a bit.
Sure.
Yeah, well, there have been a lot of books about Motown, and, I read most or all of those and did talk to quite a few Motown figures. And I would say that in terms of pure joy, even though Motown later had a lot of problems and, egos and all kinds of issues would come up later, in the period that I was writing about, it was still fairly innocent. But the joy was just in the music. So, I'm a newspaper guy. I'm used to writing with a lot of noise around me, even my books. But this is the first time I wrote with a soundtrack the whole time. I got every Motown record ever recorded on CDs and was playing them the whole time I was writing the book. So
no kidding.
Yeah, it was clearly the most fun part of the book, and it, in some ways, interesting. But all of the other aspects of it were important to me too, and some of the sort of side stories, like the story about the mob in Detroit, was fascinating to me, and how that intersected both with race and police in the city.
Yeah, the party bus era.
Right,
with Alex Karras. Yeah. Speaking of Berry Gordy, you did get to interview him. How's he doing?
Well, this was a year and a half ago. He was in his mansion on the highest hill in Bel Air in Los Angeles. I think, as I recall, it was in the winter, but it was maybe 78 degrees in L.A. But Berry Gordy greeted me in a wool sweater and stocking cap, looking cool.
Hell yeah!
He had a small entourage with him, not too many people around. He was eating. I think he was a vegetarian at that point. So we did the interview in what he called his pool house, which was bigger than my house. He was gracious, and the key to interviews is to always try to think of things that a famous person hasn't said a million times before, because they're sort of used to telling a certain story.
Right.
So I decided to ask him a lot about his sisters, and that helped break through the ice and really helped me develop the concept that his sisters were crucial to the whole development of Motown.
Yeah, I was going to say it's rather fitting because that was a real family-run organization. I mean, his sisters and aunts, everybody was really, really involved. That's got to be a difficult thing to do, to get your whole family involved in your business. Can't be easy.
It was clear from talking to him that they didn't always agree on things, and that he had certain fights with his oldest sister, Esther, who was nonetheless the strongest member of the family. But somehow, they're the ones who gave him the $800 loan to start Motown. Mm-hmm. They were all part of sort of an interesting democratic process that started with a family where they would actually have a pooled fund of money and vote every month on where it would go to help one of the members of the family, from the parents on down to the 8 kids.
Wow.
And then Motown
itself put like $10 a month. Wouldn't they put like $10 a month into a pot?
Yes.
Yeah.
And
each member.
And then decide where it would go.
Okay, this month, who do we help out?
Right. Motown itself was in many senses an autocracy. It was Berry Gordy's thing. But there was a certain democracy to the music in that every week they would gather together and listen to demos and decide which ones they were going to go with to record. And Berry Gordy was just one vote, and he would often get voted down. So even there was a little bit of that democracy at work.
One other question in regard to Motown, and it's something that's bothered Mike and I here for a while. You touch on some of the characters involved, and certainly little Stevie Wonder was involved pretty heavily the early days of Motown. I wonder if you interviewed Stevie or anyone with knowledge of Stevie and asked the pertinent question, is he in fact blind?
Boy, I mean, that's like... Section 51 in New Mexico in terms of internet conspiracy theories.
There's compelling evidence that exists, though, David, that he is in fact not blind.
We've seen him catch a fallen mic stand.
I didn't ask Stevie that question, but I did talk to several people who worked there and were intimately familiar with him, and they all left the implication that they weren't sure he was totally blind because, he always knew exactly where to go, except when he wanted to pretend he didn't know where to go.
Yeah. Yeah, he would find spare dimes sitting on top of vending machines.
Or his hand on a woman's breast.
And he would, he might even feel up a well-endowed secretary, and he didn't know what he was looking for.
But with a big, giant smile on his face. And I think it was at Al Abrams' office and his secretary, and Stevie would palm the walls until he got to her titties and then grab them with a big smile on his face. And then he'd declare, I know I'm in the right office.
Yeah, that's the story. Now, there are different levels of being legally blind. So I'm not... we shouldn't say that he had good eyesight, but he clearly knew where he was going.
Yeah.
Berry Gordy, going back to the earliest days when he was founding Motown, he was still working in an assembly line, and I thought it was interesting that the kind of creative system he came up with in his head to make the day go by and help him remember songs that...
Well, he wrote songs in a certain code.
Yeah, in a certain code. I think it was Mary Had a Little Lamb.
Yeah, it was pretty simple. I compare it to a child's xylophone, where you have the numbers above each of the little things that you hit to play the xylophone. He sort of did it that way by a numerical system. And he started writing songs while he was working on the assembly line. He told me that he would work so fast and do his work ahead of time so that he would have like 5 or 10 minutes free before the next car came along. He'd be a couple of cars ahead, and during that time he would start to compose his songs, and he would do it in the simplest fashion. He didn't know how to. He didn't know. He played the piano before that, but nonetheless he wasn't really astute at composing, but he would do it by a numerical system for each note. And he actually was a fairly good songwriter. I mean, some of the early Jackie Wilson songs he wrote, and they're pretty good.
The other thing you mentioned in speaking of Motown is the importance of the piano. And is it Grinnell's music store?
Yeah, that fascinated me as much as anything. One of the things I was trying to do in the book is why do certain creative bursts happen in certain places at certain times? I mean, I'm sure you could do the same thing later with, electronic music in Detroit and why that developed there. But for Motown and the great rhythm and blues that came out of Detroit, why did it happen in Detroit then? What were the factors? And some of them are pretty obvious. One was the great migration of African Americans from the South to the industrial cities of the North, including Detroit, bringing church music and rhythm and blues and the oral traditions with them. Another was, you have to give some of it just to the entrepreneurial genius of Berry Gordy, but there were some other factors, and one of those was the availability of pianos and the geography of Detroit, which is, as you guys know, it's this huge geographic area. It's not really like New York or some other places where there's so many apartment buildings and higher buildings. It's mostly single-family homes. And it had this piano company, Grinnell Brothers, which was the largest manufacturer of pianos in the country at that period. They weren't the most exquisite pianos, but they were not that expensive and readily available on different plans by Grinnell Brothers. And so almost every musician that I talked to related to Motown told me about the piano in their family, in their home, and how important that was to their development as musicians. Another factor, which was also important, were public school music teachers. Detroit in that period, it's sort of sad to think about then versus now, but Detroit had great music teachers in the elementary schools and the junior highs and the high schools. And so when I was interviewing, for instance, Martha Reeves, she could tell me the name of her elementary school music teacher and her high school music teacher and how important they were in her own development.
Far beyond Motown, though, I mean, this book reaches into a lot of different areas that show what a great city Detroit truly was. And for guys like Mike and I who are 43 years old, we hear kind of the tales of our dads or grandpas or whatever, and it's hard.
We weren't like able to take a bus downtown when we were kids,
right?
Like that didn't exist for us.
By the time we saw the city, it was kind of in the aftermath of all of that, and now we see it rising again. But I mean, some of the things that you mentioned in this book, and one in particular, the Olympics. I mean, Detroit was inches away from getting the Olympics that went to Mexico City ultimately. I mean, that really speaks to how great a city this was.
Yeah, Detroit was the American city for the Olympic. It was the nominee for the Olympics for many periods from the 50s through 1963 when they were deciding who would get the '68 Olympics, and Detroit thought they would get it. They were ready for it. They had key figures around the International Olympic Committee, and the only thing they didn't really have was a stadium that could fit the opening ceremonies and so on. So they had a promise they would build that. But
they were going to do that. They were going to do that at the state fairgrounds, right?
Yeah, they were.
Yeah.
And there's so many factors involved here. One is, yes, Detroit was an international city at that point. It did have the confidence that it could get the Olympics. It almost got them. It was beaten up by Mexico City for a lot of different reasons, mostly just sort of the changing geopolitics of the world at that point and the rise of the Third World and during the Cold War period. But what if Detroit had gotten those '68 Olympics? It's a fascinating counterfactual what if. Would the city fathers have been more sensitive to what was going on in the city so that maybe what happened in '67 wouldn't have happened, or not in that way? If the Olympics had been held in Detroit in 1968, I mean, that was at the peak of the Black Power movement. The Mexico City is where John Carlos and Tommy Smith raised their fists in protest of American racism. If that had happened in Detroit, it would have had even more of a powerful effect. So there's so many fascinating ways to look at what if Detroit had gotten those Olympics. The other aspect to it, of course, is that they were undermined by Los Angeles.
Yeah, sons of bitches.
And that's just right at the heart of the whole industrial Midwest versus the Sun Belt fight that's been going on economically and culturally for decades.
What was LA's problem? Well, first off, they wanted the Olympics too, but they lost out to that, but then they were still not on board with Detroit.
Yeah, well, they just were looked down on Detroit. That's all it was. It's like we're superior. This is an old, dying Midwestern city. Mm-hmm. Even at that period when it was, still really strong, but it wasn't the new wave of LA. Plus, LA had held the Olympics once before, so they thought that they owned the rights to it, and it was just competition. That just the way the South was stealing factories from Detroit. They were trying to steal everything.
You mentioned earlier on the Martin Luther King and his Walk to Freedom March down Woodward, where he gave the initial "I Have a Dream" speech that would become famous a few months later, I believe, 3 months later in Washington. What was different about that speech in Detroit?
It had the same rhythms. It had the same "I Have a Dream." It actually had a couple of lines that mentioned Detroit specifically and the housing issues in Detroit at that period. And it wasn't, he smoothed it out a bit in Washington, but you can listen to it. It's recorded, and you'll hear the same exact, evocation of the dream.
And Barry Gordy, didn't he work out a deal with King to press that as a record? Yeah,
Gordy recorded the Detroit version, and the irony was that recording came out on August 28th. And that's right when the "I Have a Dream" speech became famous in Washington. So nobody wanted to hear the Detroit version. So Gordy, several other record companies basically stole the speech in Washington and were trying to peddle that. And the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which King ran, was pretty defensive about his speech, and so they threatened to sue, and various people had to work out different deals, and Gordy managed to work out a deal so that he could offer that speech as well. So you can find the recordings, particularly of the Detroit speech. I don't know if they're on CD. It was so long ago that I've got the LP and a tape of it, but anyway, it's around.
Well, here we are just a few days after Labor Day, and I think we'd be remiss if we didn't mention Walter Reuther. I mean, he's a character that I certainly learned a lot about in this book.
Love his freeway.
I know, I'm a fan of his freeway. Is it possible to overstate the importance of him during that time frame?
I think he's one of the most underappreciated figures in 20th century American history. I think, the United Auto Workers was the heart of the labor movement. I think that movement, for all of the difficulties that came later, really helped propel the working class into the middle class in so many ways. And I think Reuther saw what was coming. He could see the effects of technology, of automation, of the auto barons moving out of Detroit, and all of the things that would happen. He sort of predicted and was trying to forestall in different ways. He was a really interesting character in that he was very close to both John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. He was very active in the civil rights movement, and he was ahead of his constituency in that respect, so that eventually many of those auto workers ended up first voting for George Wallace in 68 and 72 and then becoming Reagan Democrats, sort of reacting against what was happening racially in this country. Reuther was very much a proponent of civil rights. So he had to deal with a lot of, sort of cross currents and different factions, from the communist influence in the labor movement, which he was anti-communist, but quite liberal. He had a lot of things that he was trying to work out, and when you look at him in retrospect, you see how intelligent and in many ways right he was about things.
Well, you mentioned he was friends with JFK, and I found it really fascinating that JFK launched his general election bid in 1960 in Detroit.
Yep.
60,000 people came out and filled Cadillac Square and heard him, as you put it, recite an early and less poetic version of what would become his famous "Ask not what your country can do for you" speech.
Yeah, isn't that something?
That's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, think about, you guys in Detroit, you heard that first, you heard "I Have a Dream" first.
Yeah.
So, there's something about Detroit that was right at the heart of American history.
It's funny what he actually said in Detroit was, "The new frontier is not what I promise I am going to do for you. The new frontier is what I ask you to do for our country." It just doesn't.
Have you played Kennedy at different plays or something? You're pretty good.
Oh, thank you. No, I've never done a Kennedy. As a matter of fact,
you should hear as Bernie Sanders.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
You and Larry David, huh?
That's right. There you go. No, it's just funny. You think of these iconic speeches in history, and you don't think that they started at a ground level somewhere and then worked up to what becomes the great "I Have a Dream" speech, or "Ask not what you can do, what your country can do for you" speech. And they started in Detroit. That's amazing.
It really is. I mean, King had used "I Have a Dream" a couple of times before he did it in Detroit or Washington, but that was the first larger. I mean, he had said it in sort of smaller church meetings and stuff like that, but he'd never said it to a large crowd before and had it recorded, and it was Detroit first. And same with Kennedy. And the fact that they both came to Detroit so often shows you the both financial and political importance that Detroit had in that period.
The other interesting fact I thought from your book, you and I don't mean to bounce around a lot, but you talk about the Book Cadillac building and how important that was, and that's a spot where American League teams would stay when they came to play the Tigers. And May 2nd, 1939 was an interesting day. Do you remember what was going on there?
Yeah, isn't that something?
Yeah.
My friend Jonathan Eig wrote a really great biography of Lou Gehrig, and it was in Detroit when the Yankees were playing the Tigers that Gehrig sort of realized something weird was going on with his body and came to his manager at the Book Cadillac and said, "I can't go. I can't play." And that was the beginning of the disease, which would later take his name, the ALS, Lou Gehrig disease.
And that ended a streak of 2,130 straight appearances in games for Lou Gehrig.
Cal Ripken came along.
Yeah.
The Iron Horse.
Yep. Incredible. There's so much in this book, David. Thank you so much for the time. We really got a lot out of it. We've barely scratched the surface. It's Once in a Great City, a Detroit story by David Maraniss. And thank you so much for the time today. We really appreciate it.
This is great talking with you both. Thanks for reading the book and understanding it so well.
Really enjoyed it. Thanks, David.
Okay.
Take care.
David Maraniss. All right. Bye-bye.